Texas Senator John Cornyn blamed President Biden's, quote, failed border policies for the surge of migrants at the southern border on the Senate floor Monday. Migration to the U.S. has skyrocketed over the past 2 years, with Border Patrol agents arresting more than 200,000 people along the border each month between March and June. Border security has been a hot-button issue as midterms approach, and Republican governors have sent a large number of undocumented immigrants to Democrat-run cities.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, when Attorney General Garland went through the confirmation process for his current job as Attorney General of the United States, he made a solemn pledge to keep politics out of the Justice Department. I, for one, was encouraged by his statement, having seen the disastrous politicalization of the Justice Department under former Attorney General Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. Attorney General Garland said this, he said, quote, I will never make a decision in the department based on politics or partisanship. I took him at his word. I hope we wouldn't see a return to the days when people saw double standards play out in the Justice Department based on who happened to be in office, who happened to be investigated. But clearly, under Attorney General Garland's leadership, the Department of Justice has pointed its arrows toward concerned parents, for example, who are exercising their First Amendment rights to speak up about their children's education. Attorney General Garland has sued the state of Georgia and the state of Texas, for example, claiming that ballot integrity measures that were within the prerogative of the states to pass were somehow suppressing the public's right to vote. We're going to start voting in about 50 days from now. That's the main election date in Texas. We'll start voting a full 2 weeks before that date, where without any reason whatsoever, you can show up and vote in person. 2 full weeks before the general election. Yet Attorney General Garland spins a false narrative that somehow the state of Texas is suppressing people's rights to vote. And then Attorney General Garland, I think, shocked everybody by authorizing an unprecedented search warrant on a former president and a current political rival, when less intrusive means and methods would have produced the same documents that they claimed to be after. Time to time again, the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland has taken aggressive actions that are viewed by the Biden administration as politically advantageous. For everybody else, though, it's a different story, that double standard. When Supreme Court justices are receiving death threats, including the interdiction of a deranged man who was out to kill Justice Kavanaugh here at the nation's Capitol, the Attorney General did not respond by taking appropriate steps to prevent that violence. In fact, he fanned the flames. Instead of protecting the justices, he chose to criticize them and encourage what amounts to irresponsible conduct on the part of people on the left. And now I'm concerned about the department's double standard in handling of the Hunter Biden investigation. The public reports are that the president's son has been under investigation by the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Delaware for a long time now. There's a lot, of course, we don't know, but reported leaks and evidence seem to show that Hunter Biden may have committed various felonies, including tax fraud, money laundering, and foreign lobbying violations. Despite the severity of these concerns, recent news reports have painted an alarming picture at the Department of Justice's handling of this investigation, silencing whistleblowers, downplaying or discrediting inculpatory information, prohibiting the Department of Justice and FBI employees from communicating with members of Congress. This does not look, sound, or smell like an impartial investigation guided only by the facts and the rule of law. Just across the street from here, sits the Supreme Court of the United States. On the front of that court is the inscription, "Equal Justice under Law." There's no footnote, there's no asterisk, there's no exception for relatives of the President of the United States. Every American is entitled to fair and equal treatment and equal justice under the laws. The Attorney General must guarantee that Hunter Biden receives the same treatment as any other American who is under a criminal investigation. Not better, not worse, but the same. Today, 32 of my colleagues and I have sent a letter to Attorney General Garland urging him to provide special counsel authorities and protections to the U.S. Attorney David Weiss, who is leading the investigation into Hunter Biden. This is a critical step that the Attorney General can and should take to restore faith in this investigation and avoid even the appearance of impropriety. So I hope he'll honor our request, do what he pledged to do when he was confirmed, and keep politics out of this investigation, and in the process restore public confidence to our nation's most revered institutions. Madam President, on another matter, the migration surge at the southern border has been at a crisis level for a year and a half now. Coming from a border state with 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, we've experienced a disproportionate impact of that humanitarian surge, as well as the drugs that have found their way into the United States as a result. This, after all, is part of a business model or plan by the cartels who get rich smuggling people and drugs into the United States. But just in terms of the volume of migrants coming across, we've logged more than 150,000 border crossings every month for each of the last 17 consecutive months. That's unprecedented and shocking. Alarm bells used to sound when illegal border crossings topped 100,000 a month, but we haven't dipped below that level since President Biden took office. In the last year, Customs and Border Protection has logged nearly 2.3 million border crossings across the southern border. Now, these records come with serious consequences for everyone involved. Our Democratic colleagues and members of the news media focus their attention on how this surge impacts the migrants themselves, and there's no question that migrants endure a brutal journey to reach our country. They typically pay thousands of dollars to travel with human traffickers, or coyotes as they're sometimes called, who are known to rape, rob, abuse, and abandon for dead their customers. Those who survive the perilous journey to our border still face serious dangers. These are people who come not through our legal immigration process, but want to jump ahead of the line of the people who are waiting, even though we naturalize about 1 million people a year in the United States. In June of this year, 53 migrants, including 3 children, passed away after being locked in a tractor-trailer rig on a 100-degree day in Texas. A horrible way to die. The Washington Post described it as the deadliest smuggling incident of its kind in U.S. history. Last month, 2 children died attempting to cross the Rio Grande and drowned in that river attempting to make their way into the United States. One was a 5-year-old girl from Guatemala who was swept from her mother's arms into the river. And just 2 weeks ago, Customs and Border Protection confirmed that another 9 migrants had died trying to cross the Rio Grande. Since last October, more than 750,000 migrants have died at our border. That does not include the ones we have not yet discovered, but will eventually discover as a rancher comes across the bleached bones of a migrant who's been left behind by the heartless coyotes. Migrants are suffering every day, and we can't lose sight of the humanitarian crisis. But the migrants aren't the only victims of the border crisis. They've chosen to try to enter the United States irregularly, other than through legal means, and turn their lives over to people who care nothing for them, but care only about them as a human commodity and how much money that they can make smuggling them in the United States. But migration surges have a devastating impact on border communities like the border communities in my state, in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Over the last year and a half, I've visited our border communities several times and repeatedly have heard of the strain of this crisis. Nonprofits who try to assist in a humanitarian way. The migrants lack the space or resources to care for the thousands of people entering our country every day. Local businesses try to stay afloat amid safety concerns and significant financial losses. Morgues have reached capacity due to the influx of deceased migrants. As we've discussed during a Judiciary Committee hearing last week, local health systems and emergency response services are stretched to the breaking. Last year alone, in a small town called Del Rio, Texas, 15,000 Haitian migrants showed up under a bridge. Can you imagine? A town of 35,000 people having to deal with trying to address the needs and treat these migrants in a humane way. Well, during the 2019 surge, Customs and Border Protection reported that it was on track to refer more than 31,000 migrants for medical treatment, compared with only 12,000 the previous year. Of course, the surge in 2019 pales into comparison to what's happening now as a result of President Biden's failed border policies. The number of migrants needing medical care today is much, much higher. The strain this places on local hospitals and public health systems not only impacts the migrants, but also the American citizens who live and work in these border communities. We all remember the strain on our healthcare systems during the height of the pandemic. Hospitals inundated with COVID cases made it more difficult to get care in the event of you were experiencing some other public or other health emergency. As Brooks County Sheriff Martinez wrote in his testimony in the hearing we had last week, ambulances that ordinarily would respond to emergency calls from local citizens are now diverted to answer calls in remote areas, to answer the needs of the migrants who are experiencing a health emergency, reducing the medical services available for the local residents who actually pay the taxes that support those services. The impact of this crisis on border communities in Texas is not a consideration for the Biden administration. They simply don't care. Or, frankly, most of my Democratic colleagues here in the Senate. We heard from the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the senior senator from Illinois, complaining about the terrible state of our broken immigration system and what's happening now as migrants are being bused to places all across the country, including Chicago. But he's the only one who can convene a markup of legislation. Our Democratic colleagues have a Democrat in the White House, a Democrat speaker, and a Democrat majority leader in the United States Senate. Yet we've not seen a single piece of legislation offered or passed to try to deal with the crisis. It's always somebody else's problem, or it's just a political issue that you flail in the run-up to the coming election. Migrants are arriving in someone else's backyard. What do you care? Inundating someone else's public health system along the U.S.-Texas border and filling up somebody else's morgue. Apparently, the Biden administration doesn't care. And I haven't mentioned the 108,000 Americans that died of drug overdoses last year alone. Virtually all of those drugs, including the 71,000 Americans who died from synthetic opioid or fentanyl overdoses, virtually all those drugs come from the southern border. The precursors come from China, they come to Mexico, where the cartels get rich, shipping their poison into the United States. And then it's distributed by criminal street gangs, like the same gangs that are responsible for the dozens and dozens of shootings that seem to occur in a lot of our major cities on a weekly basis, including places like Chicago. These gangs who distribute the drugs that kill Americans fight for market share. They fight for territory. Yet our Senate Democratic colleagues who have been in the majority now, who control both the Senate, the House, and the White House, have not offered a single piece of legislation or a single response. In Texas, because of our proximity to the border, we don't have the luxury of ignoring this problem. Our communities are somehow expected to absorb and care for this vast humanitarian crisis, even though they don't have the resources to do so, even though it is the federal government's responsibility. International borders and immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility. Yet the state of Texas and taxpayers in the state have spent billions of dollars to do the job that the federal government simply refuses to do, and even then are overwhelmed. It simply is unacceptable for our Senate colleagues or members of the House who haven't lifted a finger to deal with these problems to say, well, this isn't our problem because it's not happening to us. Well, that's why maybe, just maybe, the fact that migrants are showing up in Washington, D.C., in New York and Chicago seem to be getting the attention of others who previously have not lifted a finger or expressed any concerns whatsoever. By the way, the Biden administration has been shipping and flying migrants into the interior of the United States for the last year and a half. I mean, you haven't heard a single peep. But when they start showing up in relatively small numbers compared to what's coming across the border, the mayor of Washington, D.C. declares a crisis. She asks for the activization of the National Guard. Since April, roughly 9,400 migrants have arrived in Washington, D.C. I mentioned 2.3 million have showed up at the border. But now when 9,400 migrants arrive in Washington, D.C., a self-described sanctuary city, the mayor cries out for help from the federal government. She declared a public health emergency. Well, I mentioned the total number, but an average of 6,000 migrants cross the southern border every day. And yet, the mayor of Washington, D.C., a self-described sanctuary city, is in panic when 9,400 come to her city. The Border Patrol's Rio Grande Valley sector alone sees an average of almost 1,400 migrants a day. Over the last 5 months, D.C. has absorbed the same number of migrants that the Rio Grande Valley sector sees in a single week. And the city is crying out for help. The way the mayor really could help is to pick up the phone and call her friends in the Biden administration and say, we need to do something about what's happening at the border. That would be a constructive thing to do. We're more than happy to work with our Democratic colleagues to come up with some solutions, like the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act that I introduced last year with a Democrat, a border state senator, Senator Sinema, Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from the 23rd Congressional District, and Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, Texas. We offered this bill as a bipartisan, bicameral beginning to come up with a solution. Yet we've not heard a single peep out of the Biden administration. You would think, with the president's poll numbers plummeting as a result of his failure to deal with this border crisis, they would be looking for some way out, somewhere to land that plane. But they've not reached out at all. They've not responded. And Democratic leadership in the White House, House, and the Senate have taken zero actions. I'd just like my Democratic colleagues to pause for a moment and think about the communities in my state that have been operating at crisis levels since President Biden took office more than a year and a half ago. We are the ones, and they are the ones picking up the federal government's slack and managing a crisis, or trying to, that our Democratic colleagues refuse to even acknowledge. My constituents in border communities in Texas and beyond are exhausting resources paid for by their tax dollars to serve their own communities, spending them on the federal government's responsibility. And it shouldn't be any surprise that they're exhausted, they're overwhelmed, and they're desperate for the Biden administration and the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate to do something. Maybe, just maybe, now that this crisis has caught the attention of the mayors of Washington, D.C., and New York and Chicago, maybe the administration will pay attention to those mayors when they've ignored this problem so far. Maybe, just maybe, they'll see that what's happening along our border every day is dangerous, unsustainable, and a problem that we need to work on together to address. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence for quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.